The Cold War was an intense geopolitical conflict between the capitalist West, led by the United States, and the communist East, led by the Soviet Union. It spanned decades, from the end of World War II until the early 1990s. This period witnessed significant events that shaped world politics, military alliances, and international relations. Post-war realignments and foundations, 1947 to 1949. The Marshall Plan, 1948. In the aftermath of World War II, Europe was left ravaged and vulnerable to communist influence. The US, recognizing this vulnerability, implemented the Marshall Plan, which provided financial assistance to Western European countries. It aimed not just at rebuilding, but also at strengthening democratic governments and forming a barrier against communism's spread. Truman Doctrine, 1947. US President Harry S. Truman announced this policy to counteract the spread of communism. It committed the US to providing military and economic support to countries resisting communist aggression, with notable beneficiaries being Greece and Turkey. NATO's formation, 1949, as a response to growing Soviet influence, Western nations came together to form the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. It promised mutual defense against any form of aggression, marking a significant military alliance against the Soviet bloc. Berlin Blockade and Airlift, 1948 to 1949, the Soviets imposed a blockade on West Berlin, trying to force out the Allies. In response, the US and its allies launched the Berlin Airlift, supplying the city by air until the Soviets lifted the blockade. Brussels Treaty, 1948, this pact between Belgium, France, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and the UK was a precursor to NATO. It provided mutual defense against aggression, further solidifying Western unity against perceived Soviet threats. Czechoslovakia coup, 1948, a Soviet-backed coup in Czechoslovakia led to the establishment of a communist government. This event demonstrated the USSR's influence over Eastern Europe, and its intention to expand communism. Decades of proxy wars and political uprisings, 1950s-1960s. The 1950s and 1960s were tumultuous decades during the Cold War, witnessing several confrontations, proxy wars, and intense political maneuvering. These events further entrenched the divide between the East and West, leading to significant geopolitical shifts. The Korean War, 1950 to 1953, this war saw North Korea, supported by China, and the Soviet Union, clashing with South Korea, backed by the US and its allies. While it ended in a stalemate with the Korean peninsula divided, it established the US and Soviet Union as dominant global superpowers. Hungarian Revolution, 1956, Hungary's revolt against Soviet-imposed policies was a cry for national sovereignty and democracy. However, the Soviets brutally suppressed the uprising, reaffirming their tight grip over Eastern Europe. Space Race, 1957 to 1969, beyond terrestrial bounds, the US and the Soviet Union fiercely competed to achieve space exploration milestones. Beginning with the Soviet launch of Sputnik, the competition culminated with the US's Apollo moon landing in 1969. Bay of Pigs invasion, 1961, a failed military invasion of Cuba by Cuban exiles supported by the US CIA. The failure further strained US-Cuba relations and was a win for Fidel Castro's regime. U-2 spy plane incident, 1960, a US U-2 spy plane was shot down over the Soviet Union, causing a significant diplomatic crisis. The incident exposed the US's covert surveillance operations and increased tensions. Crisis of the Congo, 1960 to 1965, after gaining independence from Belgium, Congo experienced a series of upheavals. The US and USSR supported opposing factions, making it another Cold War battleground. High stakes, confrontations, and diplomatic efforts, 1960s-1980s. The late 1960s to the 1980s marked a period of high tension and strategic plays by both superpowers. This era encapsulated the dangers of nuclear war, the consequences of foreign interventions, and also glimpses of hope with attempts at diplomatic resolutions. The Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962, one of the Cold War's most dangerous confrontations, this 13-day standoff was initiated by the US's discovery of Soviet missiles in Cuba. The crisis ended with a mutual agreement to withdraw missiles, narrowly avoiding a nuclear war. Détente, early 1970s, recognizing the catastrophic potential of nuclear confrontation, both superpowers initiated a period of relaxed tensions. Détente witnessed increased diplomacy, trade, and two significant arms control agreements, SALT I and SALT II. Soviet-Afghan War, 1979 to 1989, the Soviet Union's intervention in Afghanistan, supporting the communist government against the Mujahideen resistance, became its Vietnam, a protracted conflict draining resources and leading to international condemnation. Vietnam War, 1955 to 1975, the US intervened in Vietnam to prevent the spread of communism, facing guerrilla warfare and resulting in significant US casualties. Invasion of Czechoslovakia, 1968, Warsaw Pact troops, led by the Soviet Union, invaded Czechoslovakia to halt liberal reforms, demonstrating the USSR's determination to control its satellite states. Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, 1983, introduced by US President Ronald Reagan, it was a proposed missile defense system intended to protect the US from potential nuclear attack. Although it was never fully developed, SDI represented the US's continued hard stance against the Soviet nuclear threat. The collapse of communism and the end of an era, 1980s-1991. The late 1980s to the early 1990s marked the concluding chapters of the Cold War. The world witnessed the dismantling of barriers, both physical and ideological, and the ultimate dissolution of the Soviet Union. Glasnost and Perestroika, mid-1980s, introduced by Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, these policies aimed to transform the stagnant Soviet system. While Glasnost promoted openness, Perestroika focused on economic reforms. These changes, however, inadvertently sped up the USSR's collapse. Fall of the Berlin Wall, 1989, symbolizing the end of the Cold War, the Berlin Wall's fall was not just the reunification of a city but heralded the collapse of communist regimes across Eastern Europe. End of the Soviet Union, 1991, faced with economic crises, political challenges, and a clamor for independence from its republics, the once mighty Soviet Union dissolved. This significant event marked the end of the Cold War, with the US emerging as the sole global superpower. Solidarity movement in Poland, 1980s, a non-violent anti-communist social movement in Poland, led by Lech Walesa, significantly challenging the communist leadership. Chernobyl nuclear disaster, 1986, the explosion at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine revealed major shortcomings in the Soviet system, from technological flaws to a lack of transparency. The event had political repercussions and further weakened the USSR's image. Revolutions of 1989, a wave of anti-communist revolutions, swept across Central and Eastern Europe. Countries like Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Bulgaria saw massive political shifts away from communism, signaling the weakening grip of the USSR on its satellite states. The Cold War, spanning over 4 tumultuous decades, was marked by a delicate interplay of ideology, power dynamics, and global chess movements between two superpowers. It was a conflict not just of armies and weapons but of principles, values, and beliefs. The capitalist West and communist East, each led by their champions, the US, and the USSR respectively, constantly danced on the precipice of direct conflict, yet managed to avoid a full-scale war. This period was punctuated by a tapestry of events, from the ideological containment strategies like the Marshall Plan to high-stakes confrontations like the Cuban Missile Crisis. The world was held in a suspenseful grip, with humanity's fate hanging in the balance, affected by the decisions of a few world leaders. In retrospect, the Cold War was as much about building and dismantling walls as it was about ideology. While physical barriers like the Berlin Wall came down, metaphorical walls were erected in various parts of the globe, signifying deep-rooted divides. Proxy wars, space races, political uprisings, and diplomatic efforts were external manifestations of this internal ideological tug-of-war. Both sides experienced moments of triumph and tragedy, with events like the U-2 spy plane incident, and the Chernobyl disaster offering stark reminders of the dangers inherent in this high-stakes game. As the curtain fell in this defining era of the 20th century, it signaled not just the collapse of communism and the Soviet Union, but also the end of a world defined by bipolarity. The remnants of the Cold War still echo into modern geopolitics, serving as a cautionary tale of the perils of ideological extremism, and the profound importance of diplomacy and dialogue. Today, as the world faces new challenges and power dynamics, reflecting on the Cold War provides invaluable lessons on the intricate interplay of politics, power, and principles.